My name is Dr. Marcus Wellspring. I'm 47 years old, and for the past 19 years, I've been a marine veterinarian specializing in cetacean rehabilitation. Right now, I'm sitting in a safe house 300 miles inland, further from the ocean than I've ever lived in my adult life, because I finally understand what they were running from. I've treated over 200 dolphins, countless seals, and 14 different whale species. I've published papers in Marine Mammal Science and the Journal of Cetacean Research. I've consulted for NOAA, worked with Greenpeace, and trained rehabilitation specialists across 3 continents. I tell you this not to brag, but so you understand that I'm not some crackpot who spent too much time in the sun. I know the ocean. I know marine life. I know the difference between a dugong and a manatee at 100 yards in murky water. And I know what I saw. They're real. The mermaids are real. Not the Disney version with the seashell bras and the singing crabs. Nothing like that. But they're real. They're intelligent. And for the past 9 years, I've been the only human they trusted enough to approach. I've treated their injuries, delivered their young, and learned fragments of their language. I became, for lack of a better term, their doctor. 3 weeks ago, one of them surfaced in my examination pool at 2:47 a.m., something they'd never done before. She was bleeding from wounds I'd never seen on any of them, wounds that couldn't have been made by any known predator. She looked at me with those unsettlingly human eyes and made a sound I'd heard only once before, 9 years ago, when this all started. The word, as close as I can translate it, means breach. Not the playful kind whales do. The other kind. The kind that shouldn't be possible. 48 hours later, my research facility was destroyed. Not by fire, not by vandalism, not by any conventional means. It was simply gone, sunk into the sand as if it had never existed, every foundation piling driven straight down into the earth with such force that the concrete shattered like glass. The official investigation called it catastrophic structural failure due to unprecedented seismic activity. There was no seismic activity, not above ground anyway. I grabbed my field notes, my backup drives, and one particular videotape I should have destroyed years ago. Then I ran. I've been running ever since, staying away from the coast, away from anywhere with deep water, even away from large lakes. Because I know what's down there now. I know what they've been hiding from for longer than humans have had written language. And I know it's finally coming up. This is exactly what happened. Every word of this account is true. I have documentation for most of it. Photographs, video footage, tissue samples stored in 3 separate locations, and 14 notebooks filled with observations. I'm writing this down now because I don't know how much time I have left, and because someone needs to understand what's really happening along our coastlines. The disappearances, the strandings, the whale songs that have changed in the past decade. It's all connected. And it all started on a Tuesday morning in April 2016, when I found something impossible tangled in the kelp at Point Reyes. April 19, 2016, 6:23 a.m., Point Reyes National Seashore, California. I'd been called out to examine a juvenile gray whale that had beached itself near Chimney Rock. It was my 3rd stranding response that month, unusual but not unheard of during migration season. The morning fog was thick enough to taste, and the beach was empty except for the park ranger who'd called it in, and a handful of early morning hikers keeping their distance. The whale was already dead by the time I arrived. A male, approximately 8 months old, severely underweight. I spent 40 minutes doing a field examination, taking tissue samples, photographing the body. Probable cause of death was starvation, but there were marks on its tail fluke I couldn't quite identify. Not propeller strikes, not net abrasions, nothing I'd seen in my 15 years of doing this work. I was packing up my equipment when I saw the shape in the kelp. At first, I thought it was a seal. The coloring was right, mottled gray and silver, and it was roughly the right size. But seals don't stay perfectly still when you approach, and they don't have hands. Yes, hands. I stopped 20 feet away, my sample case hanging forgotten from my left hand. The fog shifted, and I got a clearer look. It was tangled in a thick mat of bull kelp, arms. I couldn't think of them as anything else, wrapped around the holdfasts as if clinging to them for support. The upper body was humanoid enough to stop my breath in my chest. The lower body disappeared into the kelp, but I could see the subtle movement of something that might have been a tail. I should have called the ranger immediately. That's what my training demanded. Instead, I took 3 slow steps closer. That's when it opened its eyes. They were large, disproportionately so, positioned slightly more lateral than human eyes, but facing forward enough for binocular vision. The sclera was gray, the iris a pale amber, with a vertical pupil that contracted when it focused on me. Nictitating membranes flickered across the surface, protective inner eyelids like a shark's, but translucent rather than opaque. We stared at each other for what couldn't have been more than 10 seconds, but felt like an hour. Then it made a sound. Not a word, not exactly, but a vocalization that had intent behind it. A pattern of clicks and whistles, similar to dolphin communication but more complex, with what sounded like harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a single source. It was asking for help. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. I looked back toward the beach. The ranger was still examining the whale, his back to me. The hikers had moved on. The fog was getting thicker. I made a decision that would change everything. I set down my sample case and approached slowly, hands visible and empty. Up close, the details were impossible to ignore. The skin wasn't scales, not like a fish, but more like a dolphin's, smooth and rubbery, with a stippled texture that seemed designed to reduce drag. The coloring was counter-shaded, darker on the dorsal surface, lighter ventrally. The arms had what I can only describe as vestigial fins running along the ulnar side, remnants of pectoral fins perhaps, or something that had never fully differentiated. The face was the most disturbing part. Too human. The nose was reduced to small slits that flared with each breath. 2 nostrils, like a cetacean's blowhole, but positioned where a nose should be. The mouth was wide, the lips thin, revealing teeth that were definitely not human. Sharp, numerous, slightly recurved like a dolphin's, but arranged in a more primate-like dental arcade. She, I decided based on subtle morphological features, was trapped in the kelp. One arm caught in a particularly thick tangle. There was a wound on that arm, deep and recent, still seeping blood that was brighter red than I'd expected. I did what I'd been trained to do. I helped an injured animal. I had a folding knife in my kit. I used it to carefully cut away the kelp, working slowly, talking the whole time in the soft, steady voice I'd used with frightened dolphins. Her eyes never left my face. When I freed her arm, she touched my hand, just for a moment, and the skin was warm. Not cold like a fish, not even cool like a seal. Warm, like she was genuinely warm-blooded. Then she was gone. One moment she was there, the next she'd slipped backward into deeper water so smoothly I barely saw her move. I caught a glimpse of the tail, definitely a tail, horizontal flukes like a whale's, not vertical like a fish, and then nothing but disturbed kelp and the sound of my own racing heartbeat. I stood in the surf for 5 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then I did what any good scientist would do. I collected the kelp she'd been tangled in, particularly the strands with blood on them. I took photographs of the disturbed sand where she'd lain. I made notes on my phone with shaking hands. Then I went back to work as if nothing had happened. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes, about the intelligence I'd seen in them, about the hand that had touched mine. I'd spent my entire career studying marine mammals, marveling at the intelligence of dolphins and whales. But this was different. This was something that could bridge the gap between our world and theirs in ways I'd never imagined possible. At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and started researching. I pulled up every mermaid sighting, every sea monster report, every piece of cryptozoological nonsense I'd always dismissed. Most of it was still nonsense, but some of the descriptions, particularly the older ones, the ones from sailors and fishermen who had nothing to gain from lying, matched what I'd seen with disturbing accuracy. I tested the blood samples 4 days later. The DNA was like nothing in any database. It had mammalian characteristics, including genes associated with homeothermy and lactation. But the sequence also showed markers found in cetaceans, particularly in genes controlling limb development and echolocation. There were sections I couldn't identify at all, portions that seemed to have no terrestrial analog. I ran the tests 3 more times. The results were consistent. I was holding proof of an undiscovered species of marine mammal with a body plan that shouldn't exist according to every evolutionary model we had, and I had no idea what to do with it. May 3, 2016, 9:47 p.m. Marine Mammal Center, Fort Cronkite, California. I'd gone back to Point Reyes 6 times in 2 weeks. No sign of her. No sign of anything unusual at all. I'd begun to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the stress of the gray whale deaths, there had been 3 more in April, had caused some kind of break from reality. Then she showed up at the center. I was working late, finishing paperwork in my office. The facility was quiet, just me and Frank, the night security guard, who was making his rounds on the other side of the building. My office overlooked one of our examination pools, a circular tank 30 feet in diameter that we used for initial health assessments. Movement caught my eye. I looked up from my computer to see ripples spreading across the pool's surface. We kept the pools locked and covered at night, specifically to prevent wild animals from getting in. I stood slowly and walked to the window. The underwater lights were on their night setting, dim blue illumination that made everything look otherworldly. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shape materialized near the bottom of the 12-foot deep pool. It was her. It had to be. She was swimming in slow circles, occasionally surfacing to breathe through those slit-like nostrils, then diving again. The tail, horizontal flukes spanning maybe 4 feet, propelled her with efficient up-and-down strokes that were pure cetacean locomotion. I don't remember leaving my office or unlocking the pool deck access. The next thing I knew, I was kneeling at the pool's edge, watching her surface 6 feet away. "Hello," I said. Stupid. What else do you say to a mermaid? She tilted her head, studying me with those amber eyes. Then she made a sound, a series of clicks and whistles. Definitely intentional communication, but not directed at me. She was looking past me toward the corner of the pool deck. I turned. There were 2 more of them, pulled halfway out of the water, watching me with identical expressions of cautious interest. 3. There were 3 of them in my examination pool. The one I'd helped at Point Reyes, I could tell by the healing wound on her arm, clicked again, and the other 2 slipped back into the water. They swam closer but kept their distance, hovering at the pool's center while she approached the edge where I knelt. She surfaced, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her. Instead, I stayed perfectly still. She studied my face for a long moment, then lifted one hand, the wounded arm, and extended it toward me. The message was clear. She was showing me she'd healed. Thanking me, maybe. "You're welcome," I whispered. She made a sound then, softer, more complex. A pattern of clicks and whistles that had an unmistakable rhythmic structure. I'd heard similar sounds from dolphins, but never this elaborate. It was language. Real, structured language. I spent the next hour just watching them, making mental notes of every detail. They were all similar in size, between 5 and 6 feet long, total body length, but with subtle variations. The one from Point Reyes had darker coloring along her dorsal surface. One of the others had a scar running along her right fluke. The third had lighter, almost silvery coloring overall. They were curious about everything. They investigated the pool drains, the underwater window of my office, the floating enrichment toys we kept for our rehabilitation animals. They had hands with 4 fingers and an opposable thumb, though the digits were slightly webbed. They used them with remarkable dexterity, picking up objects, examining them from multiple angles. At 11:34 p.m., Frank's radio crackled from the main building. Time for his rounds of the pool area. The mermaids heard it too. Those large ears weren't just for show. They were gone in seconds, disappearing beneath the surface so smoothly they barely disturbed the water. By the time Frank knocked on the deck door, the pool was empty except for the floating toys they'd been playing with. "Everything okay, Doc?" Frank called. "Fine," I managed. "Just checking on the pool temperature readings." I have no idea if he believed me. But he left, and I stood there for another 20 minutes, staring at the empty pool, trying to convince myself it had really happened. I reviewed every bit of security footage the next day. Our cameras covered the perimeter fence, the parking lots, the building entrances. None of them showed anything entering the facility. But the pool deck had a single camera, and at 9:41 p.m., 6 minutes before I'd seen them, there was a brief distortion in the footage, a pixelated blur that lasted less than 2 seconds. When the image cleared, there were ripples in the pool. They'd come through the drainage system. The pool's connected to the bay through a series of gates and filters designed to maintain water circulation. The gates had been closed and locked. They'd opened them somehow, from the inside, entered the pool system, and closed the gates behind them. These weren't just intelligent animals. They understood mechanical systems. They could plan. They could problem solve. And they'd specifically come to find me. May through August, 2016. They came back 17 times over the next 3 months. Always at night, always when I was alone or could reasonably be alone. They learned my schedule somehow, appeared only when I was working late. I started staying late every night, making excuses about research projects and paperwork. I learned their patterns. There were 7 of them total, a pod I supposed, though I had no idea what their actual social structure was. The one from Point Reyes seemed to be the leader, or at least the one the others deferred to. I started thinking of her as Prime, though I had no idea if she was actually female or if I was anthropomorphizing based on morphological features that might mean nothing to their species. They communicated constantly, with both vocalizations and what appeared to be gestural language. The hand signals were deliberate and repeated, clearly meaningful. I started documenting everything, filling notebook after notebook with sketches and descriptions. I taught them to recognize my voice, my name. I'd tap my chest and say, "Marcus," until one night in June, when Prime mimicked the sound back to me. It came out wrong. Their vocal apparatus wasn't designed for human speech, but the intent was clear. She was trying to say my name. I wept. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I knelt on that pool deck and cried because I'd just had a genuine communicative exchange with a species science didn't know existed. They started bringing me things. Fish at first, offerings perhaps, or attempts to share food. Then more complex objects, a piece of worked metal that might have been a tool, a stone with markings that could have been intentional carving or might have been natural erosion. I still don't know. A human skull, green with age and covered in marine growth, that sent me into a panic attack lasting 20 minutes. That was the first hint that their relationship with humanity wasn't entirely benign. I took samples whenever I could. Loose scales, shed skin cells, anything they left behind. The genetic analysis continued to baffle me. Every test suggested they were mammals, warm-blooded, live-bearing. But the karyotype was wrong. Too many chromosomes, arranged in patterns that didn't match anything in the known phylogenetic tree. In July, I witnessed one of them give birth. It was Prime. She'd been absent for 2 weeks, and when she returned, she was noticeably larger in the abdominal region. That night, just after midnight, she went into labor in my examination pool. I'd assisted with dolphin births before. This was similar, but different in crucial ways. The labor lasted 6 hours. The other members of the pod supported her, literally holding her up, helping her position herself. When the infant finally emerged, tail first, like a cetacean, it was tiny, maybe 18 inches long, pink and wrinkled and utterly helpless. Prime brought it to the surface immediately. It took its first breath, a sound I'll never forget, a tiny whistle of surprise. And then she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as pride. She'd chosen to give birth in my presence. She trusted me that much. I documented everything, taking video from the underwater window of my office. The infant nursed within an hour, and I could see the mammary slits where Prime's milk glands must be located. Definitely mammalian, definitely warm-blooded, definitely real. That's when I made my first major mistake. I told someone. August 15, 2016, 2:17 p.m. Marine Mammal Center, Fort Cronkite, California. Dr. Sarah Chen was a colleague from UC Berkeley, a marine biologist I'd published 2 papers with, someone I trusted implicitly. I showed her the footage of the birth. I showed her the genetic analysis. I showed her everything except the location. I wouldn't tell her where they were or how to contact them. Her reaction wasn't what I'd expected. "Marcus, you need to report this immediately," she said, her voice tight. "This is the most significant zoological discovery in a century. You can't just sit on it." "I can't expose them," I argued. "The moment this gets out, there'll be boats, submarines, research teams, tourists. They'll never have peace again. Look what happened to the great apes when we discovered them." "We could protect them, establish sanctuary zones, restrict access." Could we? Really? When has humanity ever successfully protected something this valuable? They'll end up in aquariums, Sarah, or worse. She left angry. I'd refused to give her the location, refused to co-publish, refused to take this to any official channels. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from UC Berkeley's ethics board. Sarah had filed a complaint arguing that I was withholding significant scientific data and violating my professional responsibilities. The investigation would take months. In the meantime, I was politely asked to refrain from any questionable research activities pending review. I stopped going to work on time. I stopped answering my phone. I spent every night at the facility, waiting for them to appear, terrified that Sarah might have followed me, might have surveillance set up, might be trying to find them herself. They didn't come for 3 weeks. When Prime finally appeared again, alone this time, she stayed at the far side of the pool, watching me with an expression I'd learned to recognize as distress. She made sounds I'd never heard before, urgent and sharp. Then she dove and came back up with something in her hands. A waterproof camera. One of ours, from the facility. It had been missing for 2 months. We'd assumed it had been lost during a rescue operation, but the footage was intact. I reviewed it that night in my office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the playback controls. The camera had recorded 17 hours of underwater footage before the battery died. Most of it was darkness and nothing. But there were fragments, glimpses of something that made my blood run cold. Structures, underwater structures, not natural formations, deliberate constructions. What might have been buildings or temples or something entirely outside human architectural concepts. And the mermaids swimming through them, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. A city. They had a city. The footage showed other things too. Tools, weapons, crude spears and what might have been nets. And in one brief, horrifying sequence, a fight. 2 groups of mermaids, distinguishable by their coloring, engaged in what could only be described as warfare. The camera had captured the violence for 18 seconds before something knocked it away, sending it tumbling into the darkness. They weren't just intelligent. They had culture, technology, civilization, and conflict. Prime was still watching me when I looked up from the monitor. She clicked once. A sound I'd learned meant attention, and then made a new gesture. She placed both hands flat against her chest, then pushed them outward sharply while making a harsh, explosive sound. I'd seen that gesture once before, in the hand signals the pod used with each other. I'd thought it meant danger or threat. But watching her repeat it now, seeing the fear in those amber eyes, I understood the real meaning. Enemy. There was something in the water they were afraid of. Something that made them risk exposure to humans, risk revealing themselves to a species that had hunted whales to near extinction and poisoned the oceans with plastic and chemicals. Whatever it was, they were more afraid of it than they were of us. September 2016 through December 2018. The ethics investigation was dropped in October. Sarah had withdrawn her complaint. I never learned why. By then I'd started construction on a private research facility on a property I purchased in Mendocino County. It was expensive, draining my savings and requiring a second mortgage, but I needed somewhere more secure, more isolated, somewhere they could come without risk of casual observation. The facility was simple, a 30 by 40-foot building containing a pool system connected to a small inlet, examination equipment, recording devices, and living quarters for me. I had it built with a cover story about studying seal rehabilitation, which wasn't entirely a lie. I did treat seals there, but mainly I waited for the mermaids. They found it within a week of completion. Over the next 2 years, I learned more about them than I'd thought possible. I documented 6 different vocalizations that seemed to function as names or identifiers. I recorded over 300 distinct hand signals, building what might have been a basic lexicon of their gestural language. I observed their social behaviors, their hunting techniques, their care of young. Prime's infant, I called him Pip in my notes, for the high-pitched whistle he made, grew rapidly. By 6 months, he was nearly 3 feet long and already swimming independently. By a year, he was hunting small fish on his own. Prime brought him to see me regularly, and I watched his development with a scientist's fascination and something uncomfortably close to parental pride. I learned that they were being hunted. January 12, 2019. 11:04 p.m. Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. 3 of them came through my pool that night, moving with urgent, panicked movements I'd never seen before. One was injured badly, deep parallel gouges across the dorsal surface that looked like nothing made by any animal I knew. The wounds were precise, almost surgical in their spacing and depth. I'd prepared for this. I had veterinary supplies, antibiotics, suture materials. I'd practiced emergency procedures on dolphins and seals, convincing myself that the anatomy couldn't be that different. They pulled the injured one, the silver-colored female I'd designated Shimmer in my notes, onto the deck. She was in shock, breathing rapidly through those slit-like nostrils, making soft whistling sounds of distress. Prime made the enemy gesture, then a new one. Hands in front of the face, fingers spread, moving in a sinuous pattern. She repeated it 3 times, urgently, before I understood. Something with tentacles. Something with multiple limbs that moved in a wave-like pattern. Giant squid? I'd seen footage of sperm whales with squid scars, but these wounds were wrong for that. Too regular, too controlled. I spent 4 hours treating Shimmer. I cleaned the wounds, administered antibiotics, sutured where necessary. She bore it stoically, only flinching when I had to debride damaged tissue. Prime and the 3rd mermaid, Kelp, named for the greenish tint to his coloring, stayed close, watching everything I did. When I finished, exhausted and covered in blood that was definitely not mine, Prime did something unprecedented. She took my hand and pressed it against her chest, over where her heart would be. Then she made a sound, soft, complex, unmistakably emotional. "Thank you." She was thanking me. They stayed for 3 days, hiding in my facility while Shimmer healed. I learned more about them in those 72 hours than I had in the previous 2 years. They showed me scars. All of them had scars, old ones, from whatever was hunting them. They drew pictures in the sand of the pool deck, crude but recognizable images of something with multiple arms and a large, angular body. Not squid, not octopus. Something else. On the 3rd night, they left. Shimmer was swimming well enough to travel, though the wounds were far from fully healed. Prime touched my hand one more time before slipping into the water. Then they were gone, disappearing into the inlet and the ocean beyond. I never saw Shimmer again. March 2021. Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. The relationship had changed. I was no longer just an observer or even a helper. I'd become something like a doctor to them, a resource they could rely on when injured or sick. They came more frequently, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. I treated infections, removed fishhooks that had snagged in their flesh, set a broken finger on one of the younger pod members. I documented everything. Thousands of photographs, hours of video footage, detailed medical records, genetic samples. I was building a comprehensive database of an unknown species, working alone, keeping everything secret. The isolation was taking its toll. I'd stopped socializing entirely. made excuses to avoid conferences and professional gatherings. I spent 90% of my time at the facility. My colleagues thought I'd had some kind of breakdown after the ethics investigation. They weren't entirely wrong, but I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about going public, about publishing what I'd discovered, I remembered Prime's eyes the night she'd shown me the enemy gesture. I remembered the fear. They were trusting me with their existence. How could I betray that? In March of 2021, Prime brought me a gift. An object unlike anything she'd shown me before, a sphere roughly the size of a softball, made from some kind of worked stone or shell, carved with intricate patterns that spiraled from pole to pole. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. No human hand could have carved those microscopic details without advanced tools. She placed it in my hands and made a series of vocalizations I'd never heard, complex enough that I knew I was missing layers of meaning. Then she made a gesture, pointing at me, pointing at the sphere, then making a circular motion with both hands while whistling a rising tone. Story. She was telling me this object had a story. Over the next hour, using the gestural language I'd been slowly piecing together, she tried to explain. It was frustrating for both of us. I lacked the vocabulary, she lacked the patience, but I got fragments. The sphere was old. Very old. It came from the deep place. The dark place. The place where the enemy lived. She made the tentacle gesture again, but this time added something new. She touched her head, her chest, then made a violent pushing motion while making a harsh, discordant sound. The enemy wasn't just hunting them, it was intelligent. It could think, could plan. And it was coming closer to the surface. October 2022. Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. The attacks were escalating. I treated 7 different injuries between June and October, all with the same pattern. Those precise parallel gouges. Whatever was hunting them was getting bolder, coming into shallower water, attacking more frequently. The pod was changing too. There were fewer of them now. Shimmer was gone. 2 others I'd known for years, Ripple and Current, had simply stopped appearing. Prime wouldn't or couldn't explain what had happened to them, but the grief in her eyes was unmistakable. Pip was fully grown now, nearly 6 feet long, strong and confident. He'd started bringing me things too, usually fish but sometimes objects he'd found on the sea floor. Coins, bottles, once a ship's bell so encrusted with marine growth I couldn't read the name. He was curious about everything, just like his mother. I was 44 years old. I'd dedicated 9 years to studying and protecting a species that officially didn't exist. I had no publishable research, no career advancement, no retirement savings to speak of. My colleagues thought I was a recluse or possibly mentally ill. My family had mostly stopped calling. But every time I thought about giving it up, Prime would surface in my pool with those amber eyes, and I'd remember why this mattered more than anything else in my life. November 17th, 2022. 3:33 a.m. Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. The alarm woke me. I'd installed motion sensors throughout the facility after the first attack. Nothing sophisticated, just basic security measures. Something had triggered the sensor at the pool. I grabbed my flashlight and ran from my sleeping quarters, expecting to find Prime or one of the others. Instead, the pool was empty, but the water was disturbed, waves lapping against the sides with unusual force. And there was something floating near the center. Something dark. I shone the light across the water. Blood. A lot of it, spreading in clouds that reflected the beam like rust-colored smoke. "Prime!" I shouted, abandoning all sense of professional detachment. "Prime, are you here?" A whistle answered me from the corner of the pool, weak and pained. She was there, pressed against the wall, barely keeping her head above water. Pip was with her, supporting her, his eyes wide with what I could only interpret as terror. I didn't bother with equipment or protocols. I jumped into the pool, clothes and all, and swam to her. The wounds were catastrophic. Deep gashes across her tail, one fluke nearly severed, lacerations across her back and sides. She'd lost too much blood. Even if I could stop the bleeding, even if I could repair the damage, she might not survive. But I had to try. Getting her onto the deck was agonizing for both of us. She made sounds of pain that cut through me like knives. Pip helped, pushing from below while I pulled from above. When we finally got her out of the water, I could see the full extent of the damage. It was worse than I'd thought. I worked for 6 hours. I used every bit of training I had, every technique I'd learned in 2 decades of veterinary medicine. I sutured, I cauterized, I transfused blood. Her blood type, I'd learned years ago, was compatible with certain marine mammal donors I kept frozen samples of. Pip stayed close the entire time, making soft whistling sounds that might have been encouragement, or might have been grief. Dawn was breaking when I finished. Prime was alive, but unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular. I'd done everything I could. Now it was up to her. I sat on the deck next to her, exhausted and covered in blood, and let myself cry for the second time since this all started. Pip watched me with those unsettling amber eyes, then did something that broke me completely. He touched my shoulder with one webbed hand, mimicking the gesture of comfort Prime had used on other pod members. He was trying to make me feel better. "She'll be okay," I told him, not knowing if he understood the words but hoping he understood the intent. "She has to be okay." She woke up 3 days later. I'd stayed by her side almost constantly, monitoring her vital signs, changing bandages, administering antibiotics. Pip had stayed too, leaving only to hunt and bring back fish, for Prime, not for himself. When her eyes finally opened and focused on me, I felt relief so powerful it made me dizzy. She tried to move, grimaced, then made a soft clicking sound that I'd learned meant okay, or safe, or maybe just, "I'm alive." "Don't move," I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You need to rest. You're safe here." She looked at Pip, made a sound I didn't recognize, then looked back at me. Her hand found mine and squeezed weakly. Then she made the enemy gesture, followed by something new. She pointed at me, at Pip, then made a pushing motion. Not the violent one from before, but gentle, insistent. She was telling me to take care of him, to protect him if something happened to her. "Nothing's going to happen to you," I said. "You're going to heal, and you're going to be fine, and we're going to figure out how to stop whatever's hunting you." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. Because I'd seen the wounds. I'd seen how deep they went, how precise they were. Whatever had attacked her had been toying with her. It could have killed her instantly if it wanted to. Instead, it had let her escape. It had sent a message. December 2022 through August 2024. Prime survived, but she never fully recovered. The damage to her tail affected her swimming, made her slower, more vulnerable. She stayed close to the facility after that, rarely venturing into deeper water. The rest of the pod, only 4 of them now, came and went, but Prime remained. I became a full-time caretaker. I fished for her when she couldn't hunt effectively. I treated the chronic pain from her injuries with medications I'd sourced through increasingly questionable channels. I spent hours just sitting by the pool, talking to her in a mixture of English and the gestural language we'd developed together. I taught Pip everything I knew about marine medicine. He was quick to learn, watching intently as I treated minor injuries or illness in the other pod members. He started bringing me specific things: kelp with antiseptic properties, small fish known for their anti-inflammatory oils. He was learning to be a healer too. In July of 2024, one of the pod members, Serge, a young male, brought me something that changed everything. A piece of technology unmistakably artificial, clearly not human in origin. It was roughly rectangular, maybe 8 inches long, made from a dark metallic substance that didn't corrode despite obvious long immersion in seawater. The surface was covered in markings that might have been writing or might have been decorative patterns or might have been something else entirely. Serge made the enemy gesture, pointed at the object, then made a new sign I'd never seen. Hands over the eyes, then spreading outward. Seeing. Watching. The enemy used these to see. It was surveillance technology. And if the enemy had technology, that meant they weren't just animals. They were a civilization, a society, something with the capacity to create tools, to wage organized warfare, something potentially as intelligent as humans, or more so. I spent 3 months analyzing that object with every piece of equipment I could get my hands on. The metallurgy was beyond anything I'd seen. The atomic structure suggested manufacturing techniques that shouldn't be possible with our current technology. There were microscopic components inside, though I couldn't determine their function without destructive analysis, and I wasn't willing to risk that. Whatever had created this was old, very old. The carbon dating was inconclusive, but some of the surface oxidation suggested this thing had been in the ocean for centuries, possibly longer. I finally understood what Prime had been trying to tell me for years. The mermaids weren't the original inhabitants of the deep ocean. They'd been driven to the shallows by something that had been there first, something that considered the deep places its territory. And now that territory was expanding. November 3, 2024, 7:21 p.m. Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. The whale strandings had been getting worse. Not just gray whales anymore. Humpbacks, minkies, even a young blue whale, all along the California coast from San Diego to Eureka. The official explanations varied. Sonar interference, disease, climate change effects. But I'd examined several of the bodies, and they all had the same thing. Marks. Not external wounds, but internal ones. Trauma to the brain tissue consistent with intense pressure differentials or possibly directed sound weapons. Something was driving them out of deep water, forcing them into the shallows where they beached themselves. The mermaids were running out of places to hide. On November 3rd, the entire pod showed up at my facility. All 4 of them, plus Prime and Pip. 6 mermaids in my examination pool, more than I'd ever seen at once. They were agitated, vocalizing constantly, making gestures I'd never seen before. Prime pulled herself onto the deck with visible effort. Her tail still hadn't healed properly, probably never would. She looked old now, older than any of them. I'd tried to estimate their lifespan but had no baseline. For all I knew, she was ancient by their standards, or still young. I had no way to tell. She made the enemy gesture. Then she pointed down, at the floor, and kept pointing, drilling her finger toward the ground. Deep, very deep. Then she made a new gesture. Both hands at her chest, fingers spread, then pushing outward while making a sound that literally hurt my ears. A high-frequency whistle that made me flinch. The other mermaids joined in, all of them making the same sound, the same gesture. It took me a moment to understand. Then it hit me like a physical blow. Breach. They were saying breach. Something was coming up. Something from the deep places, from the darkness where even the mermaids feared to go. It was rising. When? I asked, even though I knew they couldn't answer in terms I'd understand. How long do we have? Prime looked at me with those amber eyes, and I saw something I'd never seen in them before. Not fear, not grief, resignation. She knew what was coming, and she knew there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. She touched my face with one webbed hand, gently, almost tenderly. Then she made a gesture I'd seen her use only with Pip, the gesture that meant, my child, or my family. She was including me. After all these years, I wasn't just their doctor or their helper. I was part of the pod. Then she made one final gesture, pointing at me, pointing at the shore, pointing inland. The meaning was unmistakable. Run. December 2024 through January 4, 2025. I tried to warn people. I contacted NOAA, sent emails to marine biologists I'd worked with, even called the Coast Guard. I told them something was causing the strandings, something intelligent and dangerous was active in the deep ocean. I sent them my data, edited versions that didn't include the mermaids, focusing only on the sonar readings and whale necropsies. No one listened. Or rather, they listened politely and then dismissed me as another crackpot with a theory about submarines or secret military experiments. One colleague suggested I seek professional help for stress and burnout. The strandings continued, 30 whales in December alone, all along the west coast. Other strange things started happening too. Fish die-offs in unprecedented numbers. Unusual seismic readings from the Cascadia subduction zone, though the seismologists insisted they weren't typical earthquake signatures. Commercial fishing boats reporting equipment failures and compass malfunctions in specific areas offshore. Prime stayed at my facility through Christmas. She was declining, I could see that. The injuries from November 2022 had never fully healed, and something else was wrong too. She was losing weight despite eating. Her breathing was becoming more labored. I ran what tests I could, but without understanding their baseline physiology, I was working blind. On December 28th, she died. I found her in the pool just after dawn, floating motionless near the bottom. Pip was beside her, making a sound I'd never heard before, a low, mournful whistle that went on and on. The other pod members were there too, all of them surrounding her body, all of them making that same sound. They were grieving, genuinely, unmistakably grieving. I lowered myself into the pool and swam down to her. Her eyes were open but unseeing. I checked for breathing, for a pulse, knowing even as I did that it was too late. She was gone. I helped them move her body to the shore. It felt important somehow to treat her with dignity. The pod stayed for hours, touching her, making their sounds of mourning. Then, as the sun set, they slipped back into the water one by one. Pip was the last to go. He looked at me with his mother's eyes, the same amber color, the same unsettling intelligence, and made a gesture, hand to chest, then outward. Then he pointed at me and made the same gesture. Family. We were family. Then he was gone too, disappearing into the inlet, leaving me alone with Prime's body on the shore. I burned her remains that night. It seemed wrong to let her wash back into the ocean, wrong to let her become food for scavengers. I built a pyre on the beach and stayed with her until dawn, watching the flames reflect off the water. I'd known her for almost 9 years. She'd trusted me with her life, with her child, with the secret of her species' existence. And now she was gone, reduced to ashes and smoke, and I was alone with knowledge that no one would believe. January 5th, 2025, 2:47 a.m., Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. The alarm woke me. The pool sensor, again. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, expecting to find Pip or one of the others. What I found instead made me understand true fear for the first time in my life. The water in my pool was wrong, the color was off, darker than it should be, and the surface was disturbed as if by turbulence from below. The underwater lights were still on, but they barely penetrated the murk. Something had clouded the water, filled it with darkness. And then I saw movement. Not the smooth, graceful movement of the mermaids. Something else. Something that moved in a way that hurt to look at, with too many limbs that bent in too many directions. It rose to the surface, and I finally saw what had been hunting them. I can't describe it properly. My brain kept trying to fit it into familiar categories: octopus, squid, cuttlefish. But it was none of those things. The body was roughly cylindrical, maybe 10 feet long, covered in what looked like armored plates that overlapped like scales or shingles. The plates were dark, almost black, but they reflected the light in strange colors, purples and greens that shouldn't exist underwater. The limbs, there were 6 of them, I think, though it was hard to tell because they kept moving, kept undulating, were long and covered in the same armored plating. Each one ended in something that was part claw, part hand, part something else entirely, and the head, God, the head, was angular and geometric, with multiple eyes arranged in patterns that suggested compound vision, and a mouth that opened vertically, revealing rows of curved, glassy teeth. But the worst part was the intelligence I could see in those eyes. This wasn't an animal. This was something that could think, could reason, could plan. It pulled itself partially onto my pool deck. Those limbs were strong enough to support its weight on land, and it looked at me. Really looked, focusing all those eyes on me with clear intent. Then it made a sound. Not vocalizations like the mermaids. This was mechanical, almost electronic, a series of clicks and tones that had the same quality as the device Serge had brought me months before. It was speaking, using technology to produce sounds in air, sounds I might understand. The pattern repeated 3 times, and then something in my brain clicked. It was Prime's language, the gestural and vocal patterns I'd spent years learning. This thing was using the Mermaids' language. The message was simple. Where? It was looking for them, looking for Pip and the others. And it had come to me because it knew, somehow it knew, that I was connected to them. I did the only thing I could think of. I made the gesture for gone and pointed toward the open ocean. They left. I don't know where they went. The thing tilted its head, one of several heads I realized with mounting horror, multiple brains perhaps, multiple centers of consciousness in one body. It studied me for a long moment, and I wondered if it could tell I was lying. I wondered what it would do to me if it knew. Then it made another sound, a new pattern. I didn't recognize the specific combination, but the tone was clear enough. A warning maybe, or a promise. It slid backward into the water with terrible grace. The darkness in the pool began to dissipate, clearing rapidly, as if the clouding agent was being reabsorbed into its body. Within 30 seconds, the water was clear again. And it was gone. I stood there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. Then I ran to my office and began downloading everything. Every file, every photograph, every video. I copied it all to 3 different hard drives, uploaded the most critical files to cloud storage, burned backup DVDs. Then I started packing. January 6, 2025, 11:15 a.m., Private Research Facility, Mendocino County, California. Pip came back at dawn. He was alone, swimming in frantic circles, vocalizing urgently. I'd never seen him this agitated. He pulled himself onto the deck and made rapid gestures. Danger. Enemy. Coming. The other pod members, his family, they were hiding, scattered, trying to stay ahead of the hunters. Because there wasn't just one. There were many. A hunting party, maybe. Or an invasion force. They were being driven from the deep water toward shore, forced into shallows where they'd be vulnerable. It was coordinated, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. I knelt beside him. You need to run. Go north. Far north. Maybe Alaska, maybe... He made the gesture for family, then pointed at me. He wasn't leaving without me. I can't go with you. I can't breathe underwater. I can't... He grabbed my hand with surprising strength and pulled me toward the pool. His meaning was clear. If I stayed here, I would die. The hunters knew about me now. They'd seen me, marked me as connected to the pod. I was a target. We stared at each other for a long moment, this young merman and the human doctor who'd helped raise him. Then I made a decision. Give me an hour. I need to pack, to secure this place. Then I'll go inland, far inland. I'll stay away from the ocean. He made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been grief. Then he touched my face the way his mother used to, gentle and careful. And then he was gone, disappearing into the inlet one last time. I never saw him again. I spent that hour frantically packing everything important. Research notes, hard drives, tissue samples stored in a portable cooler. I left the facility exactly as it was, didn't even bother locking the doors. What did it matter? If they wanted in, they'd get in. I drove east, away from the coast, toward the Central Valley. I stopped only for gas and food, drove for 8 hours straight, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the ocean. I was in Fresno, counting myself safe, when I got the call from my facility's security company. The alarm had triggered, multiple sensors, all at once. Catastrophic structural damage detected. By the time the police arrived, there was nothing left but a depression in the ground where the building had been. Everything had been driven straight down into the sand, compacted with such force that the foundation pylons had shattered like matchsticks. The pool system was gone, collapsed into the earth. All my equipment, all my backup samples, everything I hadn't taken with me, was destroyed or buried under tons of compacted soil. The police report called it unprecedented seismic activity localized to a single structure. The structural engineers were baffled. The geology department at UC Davis sent a team to study the site because they couldn't explain the force required to do that kind of damage without there being a sinkhole or underground void. But I knew what had happened. They'd found my facility. They'd destroyed it, erasing any evidence of their existence, eliminating the place where the mermaids had felt safe. And they'd sent me a message. Nowhere near the ocean was truly safe. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm writing this from a motel in eastern Nevada, 340 miles from the nearest ocean. I've moved 4 times since leaving California, never staying more than 5 days in one place. I sleep badly, wake at every sound, watch the news obsessively for reports of strandings or attacks, or anything that might tell me what's happening along the coast. The reports are getting worse. 67 whales beached in California last week, 23 in Oregon, 15 in Washington, all of them with the same internal injuries, the same trauma patterns. And now other things too, sea lions attacking swimmers in San Francisco, sharks beaching themselves in San Diego, a pod of dolphins that swam directly into a marina in Seattle and refused to leave even when people tried to herd them back to open water. They're running. Everything in the ocean is running, trying to get away from whatever's rising from the deep places. Yesterday, a commercial fishing trawler out of Astoria reported being attacked by something unknown 30 miles offshore. They barely made it back to port. The hull was breached in 4 places, and the crew described seeing lights in the water, moving with purpose, circling the boat like they were studying us. The Coast Guard is calling it a mechanical failure and possible hallucination due to diesel fumes. It's not diesel fumes. I haven't heard from Pip or any of the surviving pod members. I don't know if they're alive or dead, hiding or running or already caught. I checked the beach cams obsessively, dozens of them spread along the coast, looking for any sign of them. Nothing. Just empty beaches and dark water. I've thought about going public, about releasing everything I have. The photographs, the videos, the genetic analysis, the recordings of their language. Proof that they exist, proof that something is hunting them, proof that humanity needs to pay attention before it's too late. But I keep hearing Prime's voice in my head. Not her actual voice, but the intent behind her gestures, her warnings. She trusted me to keep them secret. She trusted me to protect them, not to expose them to a species that has never met an intelligent non-human it didn't try to capture or control or destroy. And what would I even say? There are mermaids, and they're being hunted by something worse? I'd be dismissed as delusional. The evidence would be seized, studied in secret facilities, and within months, the government would have submarines in every deep trench looking for both the mermaids and their enemies. The best-case scenario would be decades of exploitation and experimentation. The worst case would be war, humanity blundering into a conflict we don't understand, against an enemy that's been living in the deep ocean far longer than we've been walking on land. So I sit here in this motel room, 300 miles from any coast, and I watch the news and I wait for the next report of strandings or attacks or strange lights in the water, and I wonder how long I have before they find me. Because they will find me. I know that now. Whatever intelligence is directing those hunters, whatever civilization or society or hive mind is driving them to the surface, it knows about me. It saw me. It marked me. I've started having dreams. Not normal dreams. I'm not sure they're dreams at all. I see underwater cities, vast and ancient, built from materials that shouldn't exist. I see creatures moving through them, dozens of different types, some like the hunter that came to my facility, others completely different. I see wars fought in the darkness, conflicts over territory or resources or something else entirely. And I see the mermaids, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, all fleeing toward the light. When I wake up, I taste salt water. My clothes are sometimes damp. Once I woke to find sand in my hair, real sand, ocean sand, the kind that doesn't exist here in the desert. I think they're in my head now. The hunters. I think they can reach me even here, even this far from water, using technology or biology or something that blurs the line between the two. Yesterday I received a package. No return address, no postmark. It was just sitting outside my motel room door when I woke up. Inside was a shell, spiraled and ancient, carved with the same patterns I'd seen on the sphere Prime gave me years ago. And wrapped around it was a piece of kelp that couldn't have survived more than a few hours out of water. Someone, or something, knows exactly where I am. I'm posting this account online tonight, uploading it to multiple sites, sending copies to journalists and researchers and anyone who might listen. Not because I think it will help, but because if I disappear, someone needs to know what happened. Someone needs to know that they're real, that both species are real, and that something that's been sleeping in the deep places is waking up. Watch the oceans, watch the strandings, watch for reports of unusual sonar contacts or lights moving underwater or equipment failures that can't be explained by conventional means. And if you live on the coast, if you spend time on or near the water, be careful. Because the things in the deep places are coming up, and they're not just hunting the mermaids anymore. They're looking for anyone who knows the secret. Anyone who's seen too much. Anyone who's become part of the story whether they wanted to or not. I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to stay away from the coast, stay away from deep water, stay away from anywhere they might find me easily. I don't know how long I can run, but I have to try. For Prime, for Pip, for all of them. Someone has to survive to tell the story. Someone has to warn humanity about what's coming up from the deep. I just hope it's not already too late. Last updated, January 10th, 2026, 3:17 a.m. If you're reading this and I haven't updated in more than a week, assume I've been found. The backup files are stored at locations listed in an encrypted document. The password is Prime's last whistle, spectrographic analysis provided in supplemental files. Make them public. Let the world know. They deserve to know what's in their oceans. They deserve to know what's coming.